Hello, good evening. Welcome to our conversation today. I'm Brittany Stillwell. I'm the minister with students and families at Second Baptist Church here in Little Rock, Arkansas. We are here tonight because there are kids and teens in our lives who need to hear from us. When we don't speak up, when we aren't attentive to who and what we are representing in their lives, they will fill in the gaps with a narrative. We can't assume they know what we are thinking or how to interpret what they're experiencing in the world. This is true of so many things, but we are here specifically to talk about how to talk with the young people in our lives about systemic racism and white privilege that most of us inherited at birth. We're not here to debate the validity of systemic racism and white privilege. We know it exists, and we as a church have been on this journey of recognizing our privilege and working to change racist systems for a while now. We are here because we know systemic racism and white privilege, white supremacy even, is real and so very harmful to all God's people, but especially to the people of color it was created to oppress. And we know that it has been passed down from generation to generation. We're here today because we want to do our part to put a stop to this heritage of systemic racism and the toxic belief in white supremacy. We are here to learn what we can so that our children don't carry on these unjust and harmful practices, but instead are leading the way to a just and equitable society. It's hard work, but it's critical work, and I am so glad that we are here to learn today so that our kids have a chance to continue building God's kingdom here on earth as it is in heaven. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Allison Thompson, who will introduce our panelists today.
Thanks, Brittany. Hey, everyone. Allison Thompson. I am the minister with preschool students, preschool kids and families, birth through pre-K. You've already met Brittany Stillwell, who is our minister with youth and families. And I'd like to introduce you to Casey Eller, who is our minister to our school-age students, so our kindergarten through fifth grade students. We also have tonight with us Anna Skates, an advocate for children and families. She's a performer, an author and illustrator, and a former children's pastor from Tennessee. We have Kelly Hamman, who is a licensed clinical social worker, an advocate for kids here in Arkansas, and a parent. And we also have our own Joy Pemberton, who has her PhD in child psychology. She is also a parent and a lover of our 2BC kids. So thank you all for being here tonight. I'm going to pass it to Casey to kick off our conversation.
Thank you, Brittany, and thank you, Allison, and thank you to the panelists for being here. So before we get started, I just want to address the fact that we are having a panel discussion on racism, and our panelists are predominantly white. And that is by design, that is intentional, and it is on purpose. We go to a predominantly white church, and we are, as Brittany said, not afraid to ask tough questions and have tough conversations. And one of the questions we asked ourselves was, what should white parents be telling white children at this time? What should be heard in the homes of the children in our church? And when we thought about that, we thought about the people that we know and we love who are having this conversation or who have had this conversation. And that's where Anna, Kelly, and Joy come in, because they have resources and tools and experiences in this area to help our parents have this conversation, a conversation they may never have had before, which brings us to our first question. And I just want you to know that this is a conversation that we would love to have with you. And if you are watching us live on Facebook, then please chat your questions to us. Just type them to us and we will see them. We are happy to pose them to our panelists in real time. So please feel free to engage in this conversation with us, and we certainly hope you will. So Anna, our first question goes to you. Statistics show that only about half of white households are having conversations about race. And the fact that they don't have the conversation, Kelly pointed out to us, is a part of white privilege, that you don't have to talk to your kids about race. So let's say you just want to have a child grow up in a loving, accepting household, and you don't want to mention it. Why does that not work in creating an anti-racist household? Why is the conversation necessary, or is it?
Yeah, well, yes, I would say that it's necessary. I think I'm going to answer this in two parts. So to the comment about wanting to raise a child in a loving, accepting environment, I think I would argue that trying to raise a child to not see color is not only biologically not possible, which I'll get to in a second, but I would argue that that's not actually loving. So obviously racism is a way of seeing other people and treating other people as less than because of the color of their skin. So then the work of anti-racism, right, to fight against racism is to fight against those systems and behaviors that act out of racism. So not actually acting against color, because anti-racism necessitates us seeing other people's color, but it also necessitates us celebrating that color. It necessitates us normalizing that color and fighting for the rights of people of color. So that's one part. But I would also say, and I've heard this comment so many times about wanting to be colorblind or not see color. Studies show us that children as young as 6 months old tend to look at people who have skin color that resembles their primary caregiver over other people. So children are already biologically drawn to people who look like their caregivers, and in this case are predominantly white parents, right? And then those same studies show that as young as 2 years old, children are defending or rationalizing other people's behaviors based on race. And then even further, it shows that children between 3 and 5 years old are categorizing people by race and showing bias according to race. So, and that's not necessarily because they have parents who are like overtly racist. It's just, this is part of our biology to sort of find what is familiar to us. And so to try to fight against that and say we're going to be colorblind, not only is going to be biologically impossible, but it also works kind of against the work of anti-racism, because in order to be anti-racist, you have to be able to see and appreciate the struggles of people of color so that you can work to dismantle those systems that cause that oppression. So that's my answer.
Joy and Kelly, feel free to chime in. Is the conversation necessary, and can you just not have it? Kelly?
You can choose to not have it. I would say you're doing a great disservice to your children and to our future society. And that's part of the responsibility I think we have as white parents. When we say that we want to be colorblind, really the implication there is that there's something shameful about the way that God made some people, if that makes sense. So the need to be colorblind, or saying that you're going to be colorblind in and of itself, is whitewashed. It is white privilege, and seeing whiteness as sort of the default that we are supposed, air quotes, supposed to revert to. And so I totally agree with what Miss Anna was saying in terms of it's a conversation that is going to be had, even with and among white families. Our choices right now, as white parents or as caregivers to white children, are who do we want to shape those conversations, because they're going to happen. And so I think the more that we can interject how we want to shape and guide that, the better.
And I think it's important to remember that I think there was a time when it was more socially acceptable in some circles to actively think that some races or skin colors were less than. And so to say, I don't see color was considered progressive, but that is not the case anymore. If you talk about I'm colorblind or I don't see color, that's actually at this point, that is actually a fairly racist narrative, because what you're saying is I refuse to see the differences in opportunity that have been provided to someone of my skin color versus someone with a different skin color. And refusing to see that means that there are people who are starting off at a disadvantage in comparison to you, and you're refusing to acknowledge that. You're treating them as if their starting point is the same as yours, and then wondering why maybe it's more difficult for them. And so saying I don't see color is actually detrimental. And trying to teach your children to do that is, as Kelly said, you're doing a disservice to today and potentially future society by doing that.
Well, Joy, I'll pose the next question to you in that same area, the idea of what children see and what they don't see at this age. And just for everyone out there, just so you know, Allison, Brittany, and I are particularly work with children birth to fifth grade. And in that case, Joy, my question to you is, what about parents who say, I don't really want to introduce the concept of race to my child because my child has not noticed it, come home and talk about it, or anything like that. So am I not, by bringing it up, introducing to them a consciousness that they might not even have yet?
So like Anna said, they actually do already have that. They may not know how to talk to you about it, but infants notice race, and potentially in infancy, and certainly by the time they're old enough to talk, they are old enough to prefer certain races, and that doesn't mean anything bad about them. That's just being human. Humans naturally categorize. We see things and we say these things have a certain shape, and people sit in them, and so these things are chairs. And these other things have a certain shape, and people put things on them, and those things are tables. And so putting things in categories is a vital human skill, and so we do it to other things too, like things with four legs and fur. We put them in categories. And then things that are, people that are other humans, we put those in categories too. And skin color is a really obvious one for kids. They can see it. And so you're not bringing anything into their consciousness that's not already there. What you would be doing is bringing it into their consciousness in an accurate way. They may have misconceptions. They may have come up with their own misconceptions. My child did, which I'll probably get to talk about later. They may have come up with their own misconceptions about what that skin color means. And so talking about it on purpose and out loud is actually vital to helping their consciousness with it. They have noticed race. And the other thing I would actually wonder is, I'm guessing that someone who felt this way probably feels less comfortable talking about race and maybe isn't sure how to relate to people of other races. And I would actually say, why don't you want to talk about race? Or why don't you want to bring the idea of race or different cultures or diversity into your child's consciousness? Because it's actually a beautiful and glorious part of humanity, that we have people who have different skin tones and different cultures and different practices and different upbringings, and it's wonderful. And so helping your child learn about that is actually, it's a huge benefit to your child and to the people they're going to be interacting with.
Thank you. Anna or Kelly, any further thoughts on that question?
Just snaps for that. That was great. Yep.
I think what kind of comes to my mind is I get where this question comes from as the parent to a 2 and a 4-year-old. I understand not wanting to introduce to young children how mean people can be to each other for things that we have no control over. I get not wanting to cause your child to grow up prematurely. I get it. One of the things I think we miss a lot as members of a majority group is when we talk about causing harm, we're usually talking about causing harm to ourselves or our family or our children. And really, the amount of harm that would be done to a white child to talk about racism is pretty minimal when we think about the harm that could be done to children of color when white families don't, if that makes sense. So if we're thinking about harm reduction and wanting to protect children's innocence, that is not a choice families of color have. These are conversations they have to keep their children safe And we get to choose whether or not to introduce this idea to children directly or not, because again, they're being exposed to it, whether we recognize it or not. And so for me, what really kind of comes to mind is, I get it. I don't want to tell my son and I don't want to tell my daughter how people can be. And I want them to be able to recognize it and actively work against it when the time comes, because it will. And so the harm reduction, I even have to flip the switch for myself, because I live in a society that socialized me to tell me that because of my whiteness, I take priority. And I have to actively turn that switch off at times and think about, like, who is really in jeopardy of harm here? And sometimes we forget that.
Kelly, to that point, I'm going to pose the next question to you about the things that are going on in our homes and the things that we are saying and doing even without even noticing it. So I was recommended this book. It's called Racism Learned at an Early Age Through Racial Scripting, and it's from Dr. Robert Williams. And he talks about, there are actually 4 R's of learning, and that's reading, writing, arithmetic, and racism. And the idea is that, like you said, the learning is taking place and we don't even know it. So can you please talk a little bit about how we are teaching racism even in our own homes without knowing it? And also, I know you mentioned microaggressions the last time we spoke. Can you tell us a little bit about what they are and how they come into parenting on a day-to-day basis?
Sure. I'm going to couch it with the caveat that I'm white and I have lived my life in a world where white is the preference according to what we've been taught. And so when I'm talking about things like microaggressions or ways that we're fostering white privilege or white supremacy, these are things that I am aware of, knowing full well that there are things that I still do and still contribute to white supremacy and racism that I'm not aware of yet. And I think that's something that collectively we need to just accept, recognize, and work actively to kind of correct as much as we can. It's not a one-time thing, it's a process. It's something that we're all going to continue to learn. I have been fortunate enough to have people of color in my life who have been gracious enough to point out to me when I have engaged in microaggressions. It's not always comfortable, but neither is a microaggression. So I think it can be really easy to dismiss the idea that we're being racist or contributing to white supremacy when we're not sort of overtly engaging in racist activity. And part of that is because of, you know, what we see on media, what we see in books, and read, the toys that you see on the shelves in Target, in Walmart, wherever. And so the other thing is you know your internal intentions, right? It's like if you didn't intend to hurt someone, then it doesn't count. But like that's not really true. What counts is that you hurt someone and you have to take responsibility for that. So when we're thinking about ways that we contribute to racism or white privilege or white supremacy, systemic racism comes up. And I don't know if folks have seen or read much about systemic racism, but if not, that's some good work. It's a good way to kind of start part of the process. To put it simply, systemic racism, and this is a huge oversimplification, but it's essentially sort of celebrating one culture as better than other. So what we know in our society is that white is the default. So what we kind of have to understand as, I think, parents and as families, that it isn't really enough to talk about recognition of racism or how we contribute to it, or even our own individual contributions to it, but sort of how the system as a whole perpetuates that. And so part of that learning process is also recognizing how you benefit from it and how you could potentially be furthering it or even countering it. So sort of what are you doing with the knowledge that you have now of sort of your privilege as a white person. And so maybe, a first step is to acknowledge that not only in our society, but also in our homes and our local communities, like this is happening. And so one thing to be thoughtful of is how we're fighting in our homes that idea that white is the default. So of course we need to acknowledge it and accept it. And then we need to also forgive ourselves. And that can be a tricky thing to think about. Again, we're socialized from birth to believe these things. It's so internal. That's what they call it, internalized racism, internalized bias. It's so much a part of who we are. It's hard to kind of know like when it's happening sometimes. And so I think that we have to have some compassion for ourselves and for others as we continue to do this work. And that's not enough. We can't just sort of acknowledge, forgive ourselves, and then go on about life like we did before we knew it. You know better, you do better. And so there have to be some actionable things that we do. And so we may want to think about, for our children, representations in our home. So what movies are you watching? What toys do you have available? What stories are you reading? And these are things that will help sort of broaden the idea and challenge that idea of white as the default. And again, if you sort of look at what's around us, it's all pretty whitewashed. Even in conversations like the one that we're having now, we frequently do it gently with very gentle confrontation because we don't want people to be uncomfortable. And we need to challenge ourselves to get out there and be uncomfortable and learn. Part of that will be making sure that your children have access to dolls that are multicultural, or that they're watching cartoons or hearing stories about people who are different than them, or characters who are different from them, and then talking to your kids about that and what it probably feels like to be different than others. I think being mindful of, so a good example I read in a book, which is another good starting place for we're going to hear doing the work probably a lot tonight, is white fragility. And in that book, D'Angelo talks about a situation where a white mother and a white child are in the grocery store, and the child is in the shopping cart and says, "Mommy, that man's skin is black." And the mom shushes the child. And like, if you think about what you would do in that situation, initially I was like, ooh, I might do that. And like, what am I shushing? The fact that he's black, that's pretty obvious, right? That's not a secret to anyone. So is the shush because it's embarrassing? Who's embarrassed? And what do they have to be embarrassed about? So to think about the ways that we respond to our children that are teaching them, even in nonverbal ways, that being not white or not being able-bodied, that being straight is the better way to be. So some things that you can do is actively seek out those things. So look for books, look for art projects, look for toys that are multicultural and facilitate that. In terms of microaggression, I'm getting long-winded, so I'm gonna wrap it up. Microaggressions are those remarks, sometimes questions, sometimes actions that are painful because they have to do with a person's membership to a group that's discriminated against. And so one of the key parts of microaggressions is that they typically come from people who are not overtly racist. So that's what makes them so micro as in small. But if you think about little tiny hurts that you acquire throughout every single day, it adds up and it causes pain. Sometimes they can appear as a compliment or a joke. And we all hopefully are aware enough now to not tell racist jokes. We also have to be mindful of those things that sort of are meant to be helpful or supportive and are not. So as an example, I'm someone who has a chronic illness. And when I am told, "Oh, but you look so good," that is a microaggression because it is pointing out that I have a membership to a group that is marginalized and telling me how, although I am a member of that group, I look like or I seem to be a part of the majority, because being a part of that minority group isn't the better way to be. And so microaggressions are things that sometimes you don't recognize even when you're starting to do the work. So I guess the advice would be to be open to feedback from others. If somebody can tell you, dude, that was a microaggression and it really hurt my feelings, that also means that you have created within your relationship with that person a safe enough environment for them to tell you that you hurt them. The really only appropriate response to that is, thank you so much for letting me know. I hope you'll let me work on that and make it better.
Thank you for that. And thank you for the idea that the white community might not even know what microaggressions they are putting out, and the idea of looking into that and researching that and asking that and being open to the feedback from that. I appreciate that thought. So when we talk about the conversation that we have with our children, it will look different at different ages. So Ms. Ann, I'm going to pose this question to you. What conversation is appropriate for different ages? So let's say you have a child like Ms. Kelly has a 2 and a 4-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
But at different stages of life, like 4, 8, 12, what will the conversation look like? What is appropriate?
Yeah, well, so again, conversations are important, but also how you operate in your home and the things you fill your home with are important. But when it comes to specifically talking, using words to discuss race and racism and anti-racist work, I think for younger kids, like up to 4 and 5 years old, they are developmentally, they are learning that they are an autonomous person in the world, right? They're realizing they've come out of the womb and they realize, oh my goodness, I'm not the same person as my mom or my sister or whatever. So they're learning how to be with others in the world and realizing that there are others outside of their family in the world. So the way that they do that, like we talked about earlier, is by categorizing. So they're noticing likenesses and differences. And so for really young kids developmentally, it's most appropriate to frame things that way, to talk about similarities and differences between skin colors or experiences or whatever it may be, in very, appropriate sort of terms, obviously, but also being very clear and celebrating those likenesses and differences. And then, and I think too, exploring those things with them, like pointing out differences and likenesses when you see them, helping them feel comfortable and safe in that exploration. And then for older kids, for like, elementary age kids, building on that conversation of similarities and differences and talking about basic facts from current stories that they may have heard about, pointing out maybe when Black people or anybody of color maybe are being represented poorly in a television show or a movie that you're watching together, or not being represented at all. Again, pointing out and exploring that lack or that difference with them. And maybe at that point, talking about how they might feel about some of those things. One thing, Mr. Rogers is like my absolute hero, and that is literally what I want to be in the world. It is everything that Mr. Rogers did. But one thing he did so well was he did not back away or shy away from these kinds of conversations. And one thing that he said in particular around the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, like he used the word assassination in his show. And I think this was within the first week of the show actually being on public television. And he talked about the word assassination and what that means. And he phrased it so beautifully and so simply, but very clearly. And one thing he said about those kinds of topics was, these children are seeing and hearing the things that are happening in the world. They are citizens of this world just like we are. They just don't actually have the language or the context to sort out these things. So they're already small in a big, big world. And now these big, big things are happening and no one's talking to them. And how scary must that be to be such a small human in the world and see all these very big things, and they all seem very scary, and to not have anyone help you work through that, help you feel through that, help talk to you about what's happening. So So anyway, that age group is probably the ones that are starting to hear the language and put together maybe what's happening. So talking about that in a very basic way with them is really helpful. And then older kids who have cell phones and are on TikTok and Snapchat and Instagram and literally every other social platform that you can think of, they're already having these conversations, whether you are or not. And so I think for them, again, as far as what's developmentally appropriate, building on everything we've talked about, right? Building on, differences and similarities, building on the basics of what's happening in the world. Now they're at an age where they can understand that history exists. They understand linear time in a way that a 4-year-old does not. And so I think you can start to talk about some of the historical realities of racism and how some of those systems still exist today, and talk to them again about how they feel about that. But I think too, what's really, really important, especially with these older kids, again, I'm talking like late elementary, like middle high school kids, is to ask them what they're hearing, because they're likely having very different conversations than you are, potentially. And they have everything at their fingertips. They know how to get to any kind of information they want or need. And so I think to ask them, what are you hearing? Like, what are you and your friends talking about? Have you seen any footage from protests, or have your friends been talking about Black Lives Matter? Like, what do they think? What are you guys talking about? Because most likely they're not going to come to you with those, they're not going to like fill you in of their own volition on those conversations, most likely. So be an active participant in their life in that way, and ask them what's happening in their world conversationally around ideas of anti-racism and white supremacy and all these things, because they're already talking about it. They've already heard it all. So you might as well jump in there with them.
Thank you for that. And one thing that you brought up was that the idea of the linear conversation. So I think Joy was talking about having the conversation early and often. So it's not something you do once, it's something you have, a conversation you have over and over and over again, and you just build on it as you go. So thank you for bringing that into our consciousness. I'm gonna turn it over to Brittany. Brittany says she has a question from a parent.
Yeah, we have a question posed by one of our parents. In our church, there are several white parents who are raising multicultural families. So what does the conversation look like when parents are afforded privileges that their children may not get? To any of you.
One thing I do want to say, so in my practice, when I work with children, I'm a therapist for children, and mainly I have ages 0 to 8-ish. When we're talking about really young children and conversations, those of you who have children or currently have young children know that there's not a lot of like in-depth conversations that happen with a 3-year-old. The language children speak is play. They play to show us what's happening in their lives and to show us how they feel about it. And so when we say it's important to have multicultural toys, that is to increase the diversity within your home. It is also to give your very young children the props they need to actually tell you and have a conversation with you. And so in this case, I think especially, it would be very important to have toys that represent what life looks like for kiddos, so that they can show you. And depending on their age, if they're 10-year-olds, they can sit down and talk with you and chat with you. If they're 4, they're not going to be able to just cognitively, where they are developmentally, they can't sort of just sit down and express their thoughts and feelings about interactions they have about racism on a daily basis. But they can probably take the toy that looks like them and have the other toys who are light-skinned bullying them. And then as a parent, you get to elicit from them what that invokes. How were you feeling when that happened? What do you think would make you feel safer? Do you feel unsafe? And so you can have these conversations through the props of toys, so that you're speaking the same language. Because when we say it with words, it doesn't sit with children the same way that it does with tweens and teens and young adults and even each other. So we have to make sure, first of all, we're speaking the same language. I think that's a really important first step. For me, what pops out about what would white parents need to make sure to pass along to their children of color, probably in a large part because of recent media exposure, but safety is a huge thing that comes up for me. I have never had to have talks with my white children about how to keep their bodies safe because their skin looks different. And so I think it would be important to do some research to reach out to communities that know more about. So if I were parenting a child of color, I would need to have a support system from people of color to inform me when I was even maybe engaging in microaggressions with my own children and I didn't know it, right? Like, you have to surround yourself with a village. I very much believe it takes a village, and that village shouldn't all look the same. So I think particularly in situations like this, it's important to speak the same language, have the props you need to do it, and make sure that you're kind of growing your village as much as possible.
I think I'd like to build on that just a little bit, because I follow some people online who are adoptive parents or and speak to these things deliberately. And one thing that I see that comes up is that sometimes parents who have adopted children who are a different race than they are, is they don't see the need to do basically the things Kelly just said. And I think that it is very important to like not be that person. Very important to recognize that even though this child is part of your family now, they have an experience of the world that you will never have. And realizing that, and that it is very important to bring people into their lives that do experience the world in a more similar way. Because there are things that you can't. And I know that's tough as a parent, but I mean, it's true for any parent. There are things that you cannot provide your child that other people must provide to your child. So education in an area that's not your area or something like that. In this case, though, it's very, very deeply personal. And so bringing people and experiences and things like that into your child's life that you may be unfamiliar with. And I think that's important. So I just wanted to build on that a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And Joy, I'm coming back to you for this next question. Kelly talked about surrounding yourself with a village, and I know it seems to be that the white community is open in a way that it seems new to educating themselves on privilege, on systemic racism. They're asking questions and things like that, and they are educating themselves, which sometimes can be a barrier to having the conversation with their children because they're still learning themselves. So Joy, my question to you is, what would you say to parents who feel ill-equipped to have these conversations about privilege and racism and supremacy because they're still educating themselves on these topics?
So first of all, I'd probably say that, you're right. You may be ill-equipped to have this conversation. You are not sufficiently educated, so remember that. So the first thing I will say is work on becoming educated. And the second thing I will say is, please remember that you will never be fully educated on this topic. I am not fully educated on this topic. One thing that's important to remember is that you have been, Kelly referred to this a bit earlier, you have been programmed without your consent from birth and to some extent before birth with a narrative that is a white supremacist narrative and that centers whiteness and treats other variations on the cisgender heterosexual white male as those are all deviations from the norm. And keep that in mind, is that has been programmed into you, and it's not your fault that has been programmed into you. So you don't need to feel that you're evil or that you're bad because that has happened to you. You do need to take responsibility for it, for deprogramming yourself as much as possible. Again, keeping in mind that you can probably not ever fully deprogram yourself. I went through a period of time where I stopped chastising myself every time that some automatic thought came up when I saw a person of a different race or something, because those thoughts do come up. And your instinct might be to say, oh, I can't believe I had that thought. I'm a horrible person. The thing is that that thought was put into your brain by someone else probably. And so acknowledging it, and then also acknowledging that it's not reality and that you really must not act on that thought, can be a part of your own educational process. So in the meantime, when you are talking to your children, for one thing, it is fine to be open about not knowing things to your children. I actually recommend that parents do that. Like be honest with your children. You don't know all the things, and they should be able to see an adult coping with the fact that they don't know all the things. That's actually helpful. So be honest, but also bear in mind that depending on their age, you might actually know more than them. So like my child came home with misconceptions, and I knew that those things were not true, and I was able to do something about that. And he was 3. So I knew more than he did at that time. So there are things you know that they don't know. There are things you may have access to materials that they don't have. Bear in mind, we've been talking about how to talk to kids of different ages, that you're not alone in this. There are books. There are books that are specifically about how to talk to your child about race. You can go onto YouTube and say, type in the words, let's talk about race, and a person who is educated about things that comes up on your computer, and we'll do a child-appropriate 13-minute conversation about race that can help you in this. And so bear in mind that yes, you need more education. You will always need more education on this topic. I will also always need more education on this topic. And you can still educate your child about it. And there are also other people who can help you educate your child about it. The other thing, one more thing actually, keep talking, is that in order to educate yourself, you have to seek out things on purpose. If you use social media, for example, if you use Twitter, one thing I did on purpose and is I deliberately make sure that first of all, I started deliberately making sure I was following people of color. And then sometimes you don't know how to find those people necessarily. It's a big internet. So one thing I did was this is by no means the only way to do this, but it was a thing that I did for a couple of years in a row, was during the time that's Kwanzaa, there's hashtags for each day of Kwanzaa, and I would just search on Twitter for those hashtags and find people who were tweeting using those hashtags, and I would choose some of those people to follow, because I knew that those were people that, by the fact that they were doing that, I knew that those were people, typically Black people, who were engaged in that piece of their culture. And I didn't always continue to follow them, but it increased my my exposure to people of color on Twitter, which you can actually use social media for good. And it has actually, the thing is that it has actually enriched my experience. I know so much more now that I wouldn't have just a few years ago. And the other thing is, when you do that, be quiet. Follow people and don't argue with them. Just listen. Don't engage. You don't have to engage and try to argue their perspective or something. Your job is to see what they have to say. And if it differs from your experience of the world, try to sit with that and see, why does that differ from my experience of the world?
Thank you. We're going to go to Allison. Allison has been monitoring our chat and has a question from a church member.
All right, so this question is for everyone. The question is, how do you work with children, mainly white children, to not feel pity for Black friends or people when they start to become aware of racism? I love that their little hearts are burdened by what Black people face, but I don't want them to feel a well-meaning pity toward me or anyone else.
I love this question so much. So there's this idea of white saviorhood, and I think it's something that we have to be challenged to sort of keep in our consciousness as we do the work. When I think about raising my white children, I don't want for them to rescue anyone who doesn't need to be rescued. And what I mean by that is my job as a human and my job as a parent is to I feel like support and get out of the way of people who have things they need to say to advocate for themselves and keep themselves safe. It's my job as a parent to white children to teach that lesson to them. People of color don't need white people to save them. They need us to get out of the way and to elevate their voices. And so that might mean clearing a path. It might mean walking a journey together. It doesn't mean saving anyone or rescuing anyone, because that innately speaks to white supremacy. Yeah. So for me, I think what we have to be careful of, and what I want to be careful of as a white person with privilege and raising white children who will be privileged, is not how do I use my privilege to save people of color? How do I use my privilege to support people of color? Yeah.
I think the one thing that can help contribute to this is doing your best to make sure that your kids see Black people as equals isn't really what I'm going for. Role models, that leaders. So like my child, for example, there's a girl in his grade at school who is very good at math, and she's Black. And I'm fairly sure that he had the sense that Black women are the best at math. So he also has Casey Eller in his life. There was a point in his life where like that person was his model for people who are good at math. And so seeing, I think, trying to create situations where they'll have the experience of seeing people of color, and Black people in particular for this conversation, and for the question, is it can involve, like we've talked about books and media where Black people are the protagonist or they're the main character, things like that, where they don't need you to save them. They're just they're a developed person who can be a leader and everything else. And I think having people in their lives or that they can look to who are in roles of leadership, other people they can look up to, is a thing that you should intentionally seek out.
I would say too, just to the language of the question, and maybe this is too nitpicky, but I would say there's a difference between pity and empathy. So pity to me is feeling sorry for someone from afar, right? Feeling sorry with no action, feeling sad about something with no action behind it. It's, oh, look at that poor doggy in the window at the pound kind of mentality, right? Like, but I gotta go. And you walk by and don't do anything about the situation. That's very sad. And I do think that it's completely justified and good for children to feel something about this. There's a lot to feel here. So I think to encourage that feeling toward action or toward deeper thought about how we exist as families, or what, well, okay, so you're feeling really sad about the way that your friend's family might be treated. Like, yeah, I completely understand that. It can be very sad. Maybe we should watch a movie that has a really powerful Black central character, right? Or whatever. But I do think that I don't necessarily subscribe to the belief that not encouraging empathy for that is good. I would say encourage that empathy, but empathy also has an active component to it where pity doesn't. So to me, there's I just wanted to make that distinct difference, because I think it's really important for us to acknowledge children's feelings about these things and how they may feel for their friends or for Black or brown people in their lives. I think it's really important to tend to those feelings and to help them work through what sorts of actions they could take, or things that you guys could do as a family to help continue to process that and move forward.
It may be important also as a parent to you may yourself be stuck in like a white guilt kind of mode. That's a stage of going through recognition of racism, things like that. And your child may go through that. I think if you lay the groundwork and you talk about things in a very matter of fact kind of way throughout their life, they're less likely to, if they sort of realize that this is a thing and here are things I can do. I think it's possible that your children can surpass you, and that is fine. But yeah, you may yourself have that sort of pity or guilt feeling in your heart that makes you feel sad and have tears and that sort of thing, when that's not what's needed by a person of color in this situation. And so, yeah, helping your child may go through that. I mean, they may have a sweet little heart that does that, but helping them move past that will be into action, or not being a white savior is important also.
And just to piggyback off of that again, I think we have to be careful too in making assumptions in what people of color need or don't need. It's individualized. I think I can speak for the panel and say, like, we're talking in generalities here, so like sort of society as a whole. And there may be people of color in your life who do want you to cry with them when you see tragedies unfold like we've seen on media. I think, to speak to Joy's point, we have to be careful, I think, to not hijack from people of color the experiences that they're having with racism, whether it's microaggressions, whether it's these murders that we've seen publicized so much lately, right? So I think we have to be cautious to not make assumptions of what anyone is experiencing or what anyone may need, to be open to hearing feedback about what it is that would help them feel supported, as well as being conscientious of the fact that we don't want to take away from them that experience. So with your own tears or with your own emotions, sort of subvert their experience and put them in a position where now they're kind of also taking care of you as a white person. They're having this experience as a person of color, and their own emotional reaction to it, probably their family's emotional reaction to it, and now they're having to take care of you as well. So to just kind of keep that in your brain, that we're speaking in generalities, and also to not make assumptions for like speaking for others' experience.
We have a couple more questions. I don't know if you guys feel the need to rush and wrap up, but if y'all are cool to keep going, so am I. Okay, all right, let's do it. So then this next question is for you, Miss Anna, and it was from a parent. And the parent said that last month was the first time they had heard about Juneteenth. Mm-hmm. And when you think about that, it is a level of education that white children are not getting in schools. So the question was, how much responsibility is on the parent, or how might a parent educate their child on multicultural history beyond what they're learning in school?
Yeah, oh my gosh. So what children are learning in school about our history is also very whitewashed, like most things. History books are written by people in power, which in this case are predominantly white people. So the history there is all presented through the lens of white folks for the most part. So I think it's really important to pay attention to that. That's reform that we need to work toward desperately. And until we get to some reform in education, specifically around the history of our country, I think it's really vital for parents, as they're learning things, to introduce those things that they're learning and share those things with their children as it is age appropriate, right? So with Juneteenth, for example, I mean, I didn't learn, I'm 34 years old. I didn't learn about Juneteenth until 3 years ago, maybe. No one ever, I mean, and I can guarantee you my parents still don't know anything about Juneteenth. And that's, again, just the world that they live in and the world that we have lived in for so long. But I do think it's critically important to, especially around this topic, to learn alongside your children and to bring them into the things that you're learning, again, as it is appropriate. You don't have to be the expert on all the things, but I do think that when you learn about a thing like Juneteenth that is incredibly significant, and a big piece of this whole puzzle, that you bring your kids into that discovery with you. I think that helps model for them as well that we're all still learning and we can do this work together. It's a beautiful way to model for them this continuing education of ourselves around this, and the continued work, of course, of learning and doing better.
Thank you for that, Ms. Anna.
Yeah.
Joy, I'm gonna come back to you about something you mentioned earlier about having to correct some behavior that came into your home when your child was young. So can you please speak to what steps are needed, or what steps should parents take if they see racist behavior evolving in their children?
Yeah, and I can talk about some of the things I did wrong and some of the things I did right, or I think were right. In retrospect, he's doing pretty well now. There were, gosh, actually suddenly realizing a strangely large number of these things happen in grocery stores. But there were two major misconceptions I remember my kid having when he was probably 3 or 4. One of them, we were in a grocery store and there was a black man nearby, and my child calmly said, "I don't like him. He's having a poopy day." And I was like, the man was like buying milk. And I was like, what? And I couldn't figure it out. He had this reaction to this man that he had never seen before. And I, to this day, hope the man didn't hear him. But I think what I figured out was that he was in daycare at the time, and as daycares do later in the day when many kids have been picked up, they'll sort of put some age groups together. And there was an older sibling of one of his classmates who I think he'd had a bad interaction with. And this little boy, who was slightly older than Will, was black, and the person we saw in the grocery store had a superficially similar like haircut or something. And Will, he took a it took a while. Whatever had happened, the only thing I can think of is that maybe the daycare worker described it as he's having a poopy day, like they were trying to de-escalate a situation or something. I never did find out what happened or where Will got this particular language from about people who looked a very specific way. But it took months to undo it. I worked with him on, okay, even if you don't like them, you still have to be nice. And there was some time we were in a restaurant and he said, "I don't like him," but I was still nice. So I was like, oh no, now we've got covert racism from the 3 or 4-year-old. And so I had to work on that. And it really took a positive experience and me deliberately calling out to that positive experience with someone who was basically the same. And again, it was a very specific physical appearance that he had gotten fixated on. But it wasn't just enough for me to just passively let that happen. I had to actually talk him through that experience with this person who we very much deeply loved, and talk him through that and be like, see, you do like, and so he got past that. That was a thing. The other thing, a thing I did wrong one time was that he made a comment in a grocery store again, and I heard it, and I said, "What did you say?" And every child who hears their mom say, "What did you say?" in that tone of voice, I shouldn't have done it, knows the answer, and what the answer is, nothing. And that's what he said. And eventually, I figured out what the misconception was that time. And again, it took months, and I really wish I hadn't reacted the way I did. So the lessons from all of that is, you do have to address your children's behavior towards other people. You also, if they say something that you feel is unacceptable, you have to be very careful of your reaction to it, because if you just shut them down, that may not be, that's probably not the right thing. And I did it by accident in a grocery store. We were able to get around that and work through it. be very careful how you react. You need to be able to talk about what they said and talk about where they got it from in a way that's appropriate for their age. And so to do that, you have to be sort of non-punitive about it. Now, if they're doing something that's actually bad or actually bullying, that's different. You could actually have consequences for that if you need to. That wasn't what was going on in this situation. This was him having come across misconceptions that I needed to address, and that we had to work with him to address them in an appropriate way for a 3 and 4 year old. And the other thing is to remember that my experience was that it wasn't quick. He had probably been internalizing stuff that I was unaware of for a period of time. And I did not know that. And it wasn't that we were deliberately not having conversations. It probably was, but he had gotten some ideas in his head, either from his daycare environment somehow, or just his own little mind. Those who know my kid know he's fairly observant and thinks a lot, and doesn't necessarily talk to you about what he's thinking. And many kids will do that. They will have lots of thoughts. That's what kids do. They think a lot, and you don't realize what's going on in their heads because they may not be that great at verbalizing what they're thinking. And so working with them on that, working them through it, and accepting the fact that this might not be fast. You may have a long process of working through whatever they've come up with and sort of re-educate. I mean, it felt like I had to re-educate my child on a couple of things. And it took a while, and he came up with other things that were almost as bad along the way, and we had to work on those. And I will say that I think one thing that I did do right was I was persistent about it, and I kept coming back to him. Okay, so what do you think about this now? And working on it again in whatever way. I had to be creative. One thing, me as I'm a psychologist, and that means I'm a scientist, and I tend to view everything as an experiment. And so I'm like, okay, if this approach didn't work, then I will try a different approach, and you know, that makes sense in some kind of logical way, and you know, mentally collect data and see if that worked, and you know, go from there. And you know, these days he, for example, he told me, so we were doing the online curriculum during the COVID lockdown and everything. He told me, and we had not discussed this in particular. He's like, there are not enough Black people in this. And he's 11 now, and he's in 6th grade. And I was like, really? And he's like, yeah, they're all white people, all the people that they show. And so after that, we actually started, and I was like, he noticed this on his own. So he's gotten to where he can notice these things. He can notice problematic stereotypes or problematic things that people do in media on his own now. And you know, it makes me really happy. Him saying that, I was like, it made me not happy that there was not enough Black representation in his online curriculum. Although once we started counting it, it was better than we thought. But so I will say that. But he noticed on his own that was a thing, and so it's like, okay, somewhere along the way we've done something right because he's noticing these things. So that was a relief.
Thank you for sharing that personal experience. It really does mean a lot. I'm gonna take us to our last question. Our vacation Bible school this year is the Summer of Compassion. We spoke as a team, Brittany, Allison, I, and the team at Second Baptist Church, about how we wanted to do vacation Bible school this year. And then after the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, we were just compelled to have the conversation that you had, Ms. Anna, about empathy. And so our tagline is, I see, I care, I help. So the idea that we are seeing, which means educating ourselves and feeling what someone else is feeling through that empathy you talked about. And then I think, Kelly, you mentioned like there's a next step, and Annie, you said it too, where it is action. And what do we do next? So I'm just going to pose this question to all the panelists as we wrap up. And that is, what can families do to create a multicultural environment? Let's say they look around and they take stock and they realize they really are living a mostly segregated life. their friends, their church, maybe their work environment, their school environment, their neighborhood, but they are ready to bring into their home anti-racist culture. So then how can they do that? So I'm just going to pose that as a final question to everyone. What would you give our parents as next steps?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first and probably most obvious thing is something that Kelly has talked about, that we've all talked about, is introducing media and toys, things that they already engage with on a regular basis. Just mix it up a little bit. So if you love watching movies together, there are, hundreds and hundreds of lists on the internet of different movies that you can watch as a family, broken down by what's appropriate in age ranges and things. Introducing movies or TV shows with predominantly Black or brown characters, or at least that are central figures and not just the like tokenized character. Books that feature Black and brown characters, toys that look different, with different skin tones, whether that's dolls or action figures or whatever your kid is into. As best you can, diversify the kinds of entertainment, toys, media that your kids take in. And then I think, the kinds of conversations that your kids overhear you having and that you're having actively as a family can make all the difference as well. The things that they see you reading as their caregivers is really important too. When they see that you're doing this work, that helps to promote and facilitate an anti-racist home environment. Other thoughts, anybody?
Yeah, I was gonna actually, this is not fully answer the question because there is the fact of finding actual people, of having actual people in your life who are not just white, and that's a big deal. But to speak to the media thing, deliberately choosing books or movies or other things that are created by people of color.
Yes.
So that feature people of color, yes, and it's better if those can be ones that were created by people of color. There are ways to do that. There are good ways to do that. Again, I've used social media. I literally tweeted something one time like, can I find, and like listed my specific criteria, and made sure I tagged some people who were sort of in that field, and I have some great results. And Will and I have read some really great things since then. So that, and another thing is, if you've laid the groundwork and go on and start laying the groundwork. For example, I can tell my own kid, and I have, he likes to watch YouTube videos, and he pretty much curates his own YouTube experience these days, which is terrifying, but he's good at it right now. I told him, like, just openly, I was like, I think you need to find some more people who aren't white men to follow. And he actually started giving me a list of the people he follows that aren't white men. So there was that, because I don't actually know everything. And then I've seen some of them since then. And I actually, I think he does. He is conscious enough at this point to make some choices to seek out people who aren't just white men. There's people he's fans of who are not, who are people of color or women. And so again, I'm really proud of him. But being able to have those conversations with your child, if you've once you start laying down that framework, background, whatever you want to call it, if you've got that foundation laid, you can just talk about it openly. And the other thing is, I think that do recognize how segregated your life is. I mean, that's probably the first step, is like, do take stock and realize kind of where you are on that. And everything's weird right now because we can't just go out and meet people because we might get them sick. But when we can do that again, find ways to do that. Okay, I'm gonna stop.
I think there are a few things that come up for me when I think about parenting / being a therapist for really young children. The thing that has really helped me, I think, the most in like difficult conversations or situations, and even in play that happens, there was just a point in parenting in the first probably year, maybe first 6 months, honestly, to just say, I'm not an expert on everything all the time. I'm just not. Like, things are going to happen and I'm not going to know what to do. I'm not going to have people I can reach out to easily to find out what to do, or it wouldn't be appropriate to do so. Like, I'm just not an expert on all of it. And so what I have really challenged myself to do as a parent, and even as a therapist at times, is say, I don't know. Sometimes it's, I don't know, let's find that out together. Sometimes, and I've actually noticed my 4-year-old has been doing this too. He'll go, I need to think about that. Because I'll very frequently tell my children, I don't know how to answer that. Let me think about it. And so just to kind of give yourself permission, even if it's to buy time to frame how you want it to sound, because sometimes because of internal biases, like it will come out with white privilege, even though you don't intend for it to be. And intention is important, but outcome is more important. And so sometimes it's to buy time. Sometimes it's because I don't know. Sometimes I think it's important, even if I do know, that we do the research together. So it's been really helpful for me to sort of not take up that shield. That is not a responsibility I have to have as a parent. The other thing that's been really helpful for me in talking about anything that can be challenging or difficult, or I'm not quite sure about how to do, is sort of think of it in 2 ways. And Joy may know this reference, but one of the trainings that I've been through talks about how to choose when to have action on something that has happened. And there's kind of 2 ways to do that. You can either take the bus, you can wait for the bus to come back around, or if the bus is going to take a long time and it's really important that you get there, you can hail a taxi. And so when I think about sort of this question, that sort of comes up for me because the most important thing is that you get a ride to where you need to go. And in this case, it's anti-racist household betterment, right? And so I think it's perfectly fine to sometimes wait for the bus to come back around. And Joy's examples are buses. And they were big glaring buses that were really, really huge and on the move. And so it was really kind of in your face, it sounds like, Joy, of like, this is something that I'm going to address, that I need to address, and it's presented itself to me. I can just hop right on this bus. And if it's a place or if it's something that is important and that you really are trying to do the work for, and you have a sense of urgency to do the work, you need to hail a taxi. And what that might look like is generating and creating experiences in your household with your family in public, within your life, in which conversations, keeping in mind conversations for young children will be through play, that they're going to happen, that it'll get brought up. So to not feel so paralyzed by not getting it right that you don't do anything. Don't let perfection be the enemy of what's possible. And so if you need to wait for the bus to come back around, that's okay. Give yourself permission to do that, but you can't always do that. Families of color don't get to wait to have these conversations either. And it's because families that are white are waiting. If we went ahead and hailed that taxi, it wouldn't be as unsafe for families of color just to sort of live life in their own skin. And so part of it is to, I think, when we don't hail the taxi, what's the unspoken message we're sending to children? One of them could be that racism isn't something that we talk about. One of them could be it's okay to be racist as long as you're not racist in public. And so we want to be really thoughtful, not only about the things that we are actionably doing, also we want to be careful and thoughtful about the things that we're not doing and how that will be interpreted. And so having these talks, playing it out, having toys available from pre-verbal, from before children can even speak, we should have multicultural toys available to them, because that is the true reflection of life. For me, it's really helpful sometimes to have a script. So if I know I'm going to generate a situation, to think out what questions are probably going to get cropped up and how I want to respond to them. It's a little bit like muscle memory. The more you do it, the easier it will become. But sometimes you need a cheat sheet, and that's okay too. Something I had to say to my children not terribly long ago was, you know what, mommy realized that she has not been very fair to you in the toys that I have given you. I have all these toys and they all have white skin, but you don't live your life like that. You see lots of black and brown skin in your life. So we're going to get some dolls that have black and brown skin so you can show me what happens in your day. And of course, it didn't come out as scripted as that, but to just kind of acknowledge, like, even when you've noticed that you engaged in, microaggressions or white supremacy actions, to sort of acknowledge it and call it out on yourself, because that also teaches children the lesson of how to be humble. And that's something we haven't talked a lot about, but when we are having discussions about racism, about systemic racism, about injustices of any kind, to have humility and be willing to learn, even if that's from your kids.
Thank you for that, Kelly. As we wrap up tonight, viewers, if you have any lingering questions, now's the good time to ask them. I wanted to say two things. One, just a quick shout out, I'll put it in the chat, but Anna does have a resource for parents specifically about talking with children about racism. Would you speak a little bit more? There's even a script there, so I wanted to make sure that you got a chance to speak about that.
Yeah, thanks. It sort of started, of course, I built this resource specifically for white parents of white children. It started just with this deep sense, this deep Mr. Rogers sense in me that someone needs to be talking to these kids about what's happening in the world. And I had heard so many parents ask and say similar things to what the parents here have said, which is, I don't know how to do this. I don't even know where to start. This is so overwhelming. And so I just started it. And it's not intended by any means to be an end all be all resource, but there's a video of me starting the conversation for you, specifically around using George Floyd as an example. But I also have provided two different guides. So there's a parent guide, which is help specifically for the big kids, the adults, with links to resources and all kinds of, and I even made like a little dictionary of words you may hear in these kinds of conversations and what they mean, because there were some terminology that I didn't even know a year ago, that are showing up now. And so I put that together. And then there's a family guide that has the script from the video. So if you'd rather the words come from your mouth as the caregiver, that script, like Kelly was saying, I gave you a script and you can read that as a family. And then there are all kinds of activities and links to other resources that you can use as a family unit and ideas for action as well. So those are all on wearekidco.com/anti-racism resources. And yeah, I'll have Brittany can put that link up, but yeah, it's free to use. Please use it, share it, do whatever you need to do with it. It's there for you.
Thank you for that.
Sure.
As we will be kind of keeping up with resources as we go. Allison can tell you more about that. And our panelists have graciously agreed to be a resource even in continued conversation. Kelly, we did have a question in the chat about if you could speak a little bit more, we're running out of time, or maybe point us in the right direction about white programming and what does that look like and what does that mean?
That's a great question. And you know what? I don't exactly know, but we can find out together. So that's our group homework. I take it to mean sort of the white programming in terms of like the socialization of whiteness as sort of the norm. And so I'm just not sure sort of what the person is specifically asking about. If it's sort of like what it is and how it happens, it's very insidious, meaning it's like a slow sort of like glacier pace until a certain age for children. And it comes from things that are in their environment. So again, the language of children is play. So the toys that they play with send messages to them about what's considered normal or okay. And so if at a daycare or in your home or at grandparents' house, the only toys available are those that sort of facilitate white as the baseline or as the norm, then whether your child is a child of color or a white child, the message that is being sent is that white is the better and that anything outside of that is other. And humans don't do well with other. And so it's sort of, kind of puts a magnifying glass on what's different than being white, and how it makes someone not as good as. And so it's much like we've talked about in media, in toys, in representations that children are given in stories. And so it's not necessarily something that is consciously done within families, and it happens in families of color as well. Because if you think about what's available to white kids, that's also what's available to children of color. And so they're not even seeing themselves reflected in the media that they see. And so when we talk about white programming, it is not exclusively to white people. And so, I think we have to do a better job as parents and as a society in general of having more diversity. And certainly when it comes to skin tone, and also people who have one arm, people who are in a wheelchair. And so I think as parents and as churches and as social groups, we need to do better jobs of representing things that would be considered other and make that the new normal.
Mhm.
I want to just first of all thank everyone for being here tonight. I know we've gone longer than we had intended, but it was a great conversation, and I think one that was certainly needed. And just to Joy's point about moving from what you're doing in the home to out of the home, I know that everyone is excited to move out of their home at some point in the very near future. But when I think about what we have in Little Rock, the Black-owned bookstores, the museums, the restaurants, the plays, just all that this city has to offer. And I could probably speak that way about a lot of cities all over the country. The things that are available to us in order to diversify. I know our conversation tonight was about our home, but also our lives and our worlds. This is a very important conversation. I really appreciate you. So to Kelly, Anna, and Joy, thank you so much for being here tonight. We really do appreciate it. On behalf of Second Baptist Church, thank you so much.
Thank you for letting me be a part of it. It's
Thank
exciting.
you for having us.
And for folks that have been watching, we will share resources from tonight's conversation on the website. So tobclr.com, we will add a page that has all of the resources that we talked about tonight. We will also offer Kelly and Anna and Joy's contact info if you have questions you want to reach out directly. But again, thank you. And we'll post on Facebook when those are available so you all can head there. Yeah, thank you.
As we close tonight, we've been talking a lot about the work. And there's work to be done, and it is hard work, but it is important work, it is critical work, and it is kingdom work. And so as we go from this place today, may we go with a renewed energy, with grace for ourselves and for others. And may we go seeking to do the best that we can to love all of God's people who God has created in God's beautiful image. May we be bearers of that message in the world. May we go in peace. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.